Hey, hi, I'm Robert Tercek, and today I'm going to share with you my thoughts about how artificial intelligence is going to affect cinematic storytelling and the way we tell stories in movies and TV shows. I've spent most of my career working in the media industry, either inside of motion picture companies, studios, and TV networks, or outside with disruptive companies that are trying to transform it and introduce new technology. I launched some of the very first streaming services. I was involved in some of the very first cable TV and satellite TV launches internationally. With Oprah Winfrey, I launched one of the very first converged broadband and cable TV networks. But in the most recent years, I've been very focused on generative artificial intelligence. And in the last couple of years, I founded a studio with some colleagues to make tools designed to tell stories, cinematic stories, using generative artificial intelligence. And recently, a group called the Hollywood Professionals Association invited me to give some remarks. Now, the folks in the Hollywood Professionals Association include the heads of production from most of the major studios and the streaming companies and TV networks, and also a lot of the folks who run post-production facilities, special effects shops, and so on. So it's a group of people at the peak of their skills who are deeply involved in the Hollywood production scene. They have an annual event each year. They call it the Tech Retreat, and they invited me to give the closing keynote speech on the topic of storytelling, cinematic storytelling with artificial intelligence. And so without further ado, let me share with you a version of the talk that I gave to the folks at the Hollywood Professionals Association. My topic is storytelling without limits, because I think artificial intelligence is going to help us transcend the limitations of budget and time and cast and crew and size and space that currently constrain the way we tell stories. And in this talk, I'll explain exactly what I mean. But to get started, I want to start with a story from a while back, a story from the past, because I think it'll put the magnitude of the change we're about to experience in perspective. I'm going to talk to you about what happened around the year 2000. At that point, I was the head of digital media at Sony Pictures. I loved that job, but I left there to join a startup company that I thought was so exciting, a company called Packet Video. It was the very first company in the world to put streaming video on mobile devices. We could literally stream video over the air to a mobile phone. Now, today, that's quite commonplace, but back in 2000, that was novel. It was unexpected, and some people thought it was preposterous. My colleagues in the TV industry thought it was insane, and they told me so. And they weren't wrong, because at the time, the devices weren't great. The devices pictured here were the most state-of-the-art phones that were available at the time. As you can see, it's a very small screen. The networks weren't very fast. There was no broadband in mobile at that point, and so forth. So I understood where they were coming from, but I knew one thing that the media company folks did not know. You see, Packet Video had attracted investment from the major semiconductor companies like Intel and Texas Instruments, and these companies cared deeply about adding video capability to mobile phones because they knew it was going to spur take-up and demand for more chips. And so they were fostering us. And to build those chips, we had to integrate our software into their semiconductors. So we had great insight into the semiconductor roadmaps. We knew what was coming. And that's why I knew that in a matter of time, there were going to be a new generation of phones that we would call smartphones. And I knew that many years before they became available. But here we are in 2025, 2026. 95% of the people who watch television have a smartphone, either in hand or nearby while they're watching TV. And by the way, this is not a secret. It's well understood. Matt Damon made a joke about it. He was on the Joe Rogan podcast a few weeks back, and he made a joke. He said people are watching TikTok on their smartphones while they're sitting on the couch watching Netflix on TV. Now, what's interesting about this is the second screen in this scenario is the television. That's on in the background. What people are really paying attention to is the phone in their hand. And in fact, Netflix is aware of this. They've already given instruction to screenwriters to change the dialogue, to make the dialogue a little bit more expositive so that people who aren't watching, who are looking at their phone, can hear what's happening in the show while they're distracted by their phone. That's not necessarily great for the TV industry, but that's where we are. That's where things stand. So in just a short period of time, we've shifted our habits completely away from the big screen to the little screen in your hand. The big beneficiary of this transformation has been YouTube, not Netflix, not necessarily TikTok, though they've benefited massively. The biggest winner by far has been YouTube. Now, my colleagues in the TV industry tend to look down on YouTube. Sometimes they dismiss YouTube as web junk. They don't really think of it in the same category as TV. It's measured differently as well. But I think those folks should look a little closer, because in recent years, Netflix has surpassed broadcast and cable TV in terms of revenue and audience reach and time spent viewing. That's not all. On every device in the world, YouTube is the number one streaming video app, and that includes the smart TV in your living room. A lot of people think the number one streaming service is Netflix or maybe Disney Plus, but they're wrong about that. In every country in the world, YouTube is the number one streaming service. And one of the secrets to YouTube's success is that they tap the power of the smartphone in the hands of the audience, and they allow those people to upload video. They get a ton of video for free. In fact, they get more than 600 hours of content uploaded from their fans and their audience every minute of the day. And what that means is that in a single afternoon, YouTube has more video uploaded to it for free than all the TV companies, all the broadcasting and cable companies, and all the motion picture studios in the world combined can produce in an entire year. Now, the video that's produced for YouTube is candidly cheap. It's done fast. It's kind of authentic because it's handmade, it's homemade, and that's quite obvious in the way it's edited and produced. But the main thing I want to point out here is it's really weird. A lot of the video on YouTube is just extremely weird. It would not fit in the categories that we're familiar with in television. For instance, there's a whole channel devoted to unpacking and unboxing Kinder chocolate eggs. There are other channels that are full of how-to videos that teach you how to do things like make an unboxing video. And don't forget, every week, hundreds of millions of people will spend hours watching other people play video games. Live streaming video games is a hugely popular thing. In this example, I'm showing Code Miko, who's an invented 3D character who plays video games while other people watch her playing the games. The point here is that the emergent behavior in any kind of networked entertainment is always hard to predict, and sometimes it's deeply strange because no one can anticipate what uses people are going to put these tools to. Now, at the same time, there's been a big transformation in the television industry. And so I want to spend a little bit more time talking about what happened in TV in the last 25 years. Now, TV globally is about $1 trillion business. And when I say TV, I should broadly say it's all forms of motion pictures. So that's box office from theatrical motion pictures, home video, streaming video, broadcast, satellite, cable television, as well as social video on the social platforms. So all forms of video combined is about $1 trillion market, give or take a few billion dollars. North America comprises 35% of that market. It's the biggest market, followed by Southeast Asia, and then Europe follows. The rest of the world makes the other 15%. The economics for broadcast TV, cable TV, and motion pictures are collapsing. This is one of the impacts of the shift to streaming. Revenue for traditional TV, for instance, has been in decline steadily for more than a decade. At the same time, the cost of content continues to go up, in some cases by a factor of 10%. So this is clearly unsustainable. You can't have a business where revenue is dropping and the costs are rising. You're going to have to make some dramatic changes. That's one of the reasons why I think generative AI is actually going to be a great solution for some of the problems that ail Hollywood right now. But in the meantime, one of the inevitable consequences of rising cost and falling revenue is consolidation. There's been a wave of mergers and acquisitions since the streaming era began. So we've seen big 6 motion picture companies consolidate down to 4, and now with the acquisition of Warner Brothers by either Netflix or probably Paramount Global, when the dust settles on that acquisition, we might be left with 3 major studio companies. And along with every one of those waves of consolidation came budget cuts, layoffs, and heavy reliance on formulaic, proven franchises. In other words, risk aversion. This is not necessarily good for storytelling. So the current trends in the traditional TV business, I don't think they favor good storytelling or creative risk-taking. So those are some of the impacts of the digitization of distribution, the advent of streaming. And effectively what happened is the motion picture business was hesitant to get into streaming. They found reasons to delay. That left a lane open for other people to try to use streaming video, and other platforms like YouTube, Netflix arose to fill that gap and to satisfy that demand. And what we saw is a total transformation of the industry as a result. That's the history of the distribution, of the digitization of distribution. And as you can see, it played out over a period of 25 years. So it takes quite a while for the effects of this, and we're still dealing with the after effects of that. Now I want to shift your focus to the digitization of creation, which is what I think is going to happen. Generative AI is going to digitize the creative process, and in many cases, it will automate some of the grunt work in the creative process. As you can see from these pictures, it's quite obvious that the generative AI is going to lead us into some very strange places and some very weird storytelling. You can also see that the quality of the tools has gotten quite good. Some people have an outdated notion that the quality of generative AI is bad, but it improves very rapidly on a weekly or monthly basis. So you have to check in constantly to see the improvements that are happening. The point here is that innovation is moving very fast in this space. I bring that up because a lot of folks I know in the motion picture business tend to look at the weaknesses of AI and they dismiss it. They write it off. They say it'll never work. It's the sort of same story that I heard when I was launching streaming video, when they said, well, the networks are too slow, the devices aren't high resolution, the color quality isn't good enough. They found reasons to ignore it and push it off their desk so they didn't have to deal with it. I think it creates a blind spot. And I think when you hear people talking, people in the motion picture business talking about generative AI, and they say, well, the quality isn't very good, or the stories are boring and unoriginal, or there's not enough control in the tools, and I can't keep consistency from shot to shot, or gee, the final product lacks a human spark or the human touch. These are all just excuses for not dealing with generative AI. They're a reason to look away from it and ignore it. And I think that creates a blind spot. Let me give you one specific example of this. Recently, Ben Affleck spoke out about generative AI. He was actually on that same podcast, that Joe Rogan podcast that Matt Damon was on, that I mentioned a moment ago. Ben was asked a question about what he thought about generative AI. Well, he has a lot to say. He has many, many thoughts. He's got a lot of opinions about generative AI, and mostly dismissive. He dismissed it in two ways on this show. First, he said, look, it's just going to be a tool, and it's just going to be used to replace video effects. So he said, I don't want to be in the VFX business. He said that in many other interviews in the past. So he seems to think that the impact of generative AI is constrained only to special effects and video effects. On the other hand, he said there's another scenario, which is that you just press a button and presto, it generates an automatic story. And he said that's bullshit. It'll never happen. I get what he's saying there, and I do agree. I think storytelling is the province of humans. I think you're going to have generative AI tools that are driven by humans, and I'm very focused on AI tools for human artists to use. In other words, full automation isn't really my bag either. But when Ben posits these two scenarios, what I'm trying to point out here is that he's creating a blind spot, because what he's doing is overlooking a vast range of other scenarios where generative AI tools are already being used. In fact, there's much more going on than just generative video. I think that generative video actually shrinks the category down in a way that blinds us. What you have to consider is that there are currently generative AI tools available for every phase of motion picture, from the earliest stages of story development, world building, creating the logic for the world, and ultimately screenwriting. There are also tools for all the stages of pre-production, including pre-visualization and storyboards, the ability to do any kind of design work. And then, of course, for principal photography, we're already seeing AI tools improve substantially. Just in the last month, we saw new models released from ByteDance, a new model called CDance 2.0, and another Chinese model was introduced called Kling 3.0. And these are outstanding in terms of the quality of the consistency from shot to shot, the lighting control, even the ability to get a decent performance from the actors. These are all areas that are improving very fast. And finally, don't forget, AI is already being used in post-production in a number of ways, not just for video effects or to replace computer graphics, but also for editing process. A number of the grunt tasks in editing can be done by AI, and there are tools already available on the market to do that. And we can also use AI for music score generation and sound effects. This is why I think it's inevitable that generative AI tools are going to be used for cinematic storytelling. And of course, this is a very highly contested viewpoint. A lot of people disagree with me. Many of the people in this photograph, what I'm showing you is a picture of the Writers Guild on strike. And these folks are very much opposed to generative AI because they think it reduces the creative work. They think it's a net loss. And they're not interested in adopting these tools. They certainly don't want to do it at gunpoint if the studios insist on it. But I know something that these folks don't know, which is that, once again, I'm looking at the semiconductors, and the cost of compute from the semiconductors continues to drop. And this is the key thing to pay attention to when you're considering the impact of generative AI, which is that the cost is falling by a factor of at least 40 to 60% a year. We know this because we know what the next few generations of graphical processing units are going to cost, and the efficiency. Each generation of GPU is 2 or 3 times more energy efficient, and that means that the cost of compute is going to drop by the equivalent factor. Those costs are passed along to the people who are using the tools to generate video. In other words, this is a complicated way of saying that the cost of generating a frame of video is going to fall in line with the cost of compute, and that's definitely going to drop by about 50% a year. Let me put this in the perspective of filmmaking. So today, if you want to make a motion picture, say a feature film, a typical 90-minute feature film costs about $100 million. So that's roughly $1 million a minute to make a feature film. To make a major streaming series on a service like Netflix, the most expensive streaming series costs $20 million an episode. Now that breaks down to about $300,000 per minute. Now, in the last couple of years, as I mentioned, I was a principal in a company called Neuro Studios that was creating new tools using generative AI to tell stories. And our cost per minute by the end of last year was below $1,000 a minute. This year, I'm told it'll go below $300 a minute. And by next year, will breach the $100 per minute threshold. And that's really important because at numbers like that, a small team of creators can be profitable with a series on YouTube. That's going to transform storytelling in ways I'll explain in a moment. Now, at the same time, simultaneously with that cost drop, you're seeing the quality increase. So there's really two trends here happening. The cost is going down and the quality is going up. I think it's in a number of years, if the current trends hold, and I see no reason why they won't, if the current rate of improvement continues into the future, I think it's inevitable that you're going to see video that is indistinguishable to the average person, the average viewer. That generative AI will be indistinguishable from the film that's shot on a soundstage with a camera. And generative characters, this example is Tilly Norwood, which is a bit of a marketing stunt, but nevertheless, it illustrates the point. Generated characters, or what we might call synthetic actors, are going to be indistinguishable from human actors. I know this is highly controversial, but I'm just looking at the trends, and this is what I believe is going to occur. And that means that another scenario is possible, and this is, to me, is the most interesting of all the scenarios. It's not the only scenario, but it's the one I find most fascinating. The idea that a small team using desktop computers can create an entire show, series, or movie from their desktops with no camera, no cast, no crew, no set, no props, no soundstage. They're going to generate everything virtually with generative AI. It's not the only way generative AI is going to be used. There's a number of scenarios where it can be used in a hybrid mode with traditional production, but for me, this is the most interesting one. It posits such a crazy scenario, so many possibilities I'll get into in a moment. My main point here is when you're considering the impact of generative AI on storytelling and filmmaking, you have to look beyond the blind spot. Don't dwell on the weaknesses or the flaws, because those are being addressed right now. Our company's fixing them. Over time, those things will improve. Instead, I want to direct your attention to the affordances. And the affordances are the things that AI can do that traditional filmmaking can never do. And that includes rapid iteration at low cost. You can generate dozens of shots in a single day. Fluid output. If you can generate shots that quickly, it means that your film is never really locked. You won't have a final cut, and it won't be a fixed product. It'll be a living thing that you can continue to iterate on. It also means that remixing is incredibly easy. You've seen examples of this. You can see mashups of all sorts on Instagram with generative AI tools. So generative AI makes it incredibly easy to remix. And that invites the fans to participate as well. Sora from OpenAI is a good example of a generative AI app that enables fans to take a show that they've watched and remix it in their own way and tell their own story. It also makes it possible to generate exotic, vivid, surreal science fiction scenarios or mythology scenarios, things that you couldn't really do in a traditional film unless you spent a fortune on special effects. But you can do that very, very cheaply and very quickly with generative artificial intelligence. And that's why I believe we're going to transform entire genres. I'll explain more about what I mean later as I get into this talk. But these affordances, my key point here is this is what you should keep your eye on with generative AI, because this is where disruption is going to come from, and this is where the new modes of storytelling are going to occur. Now, when I think about the future, I always like to use a framework, and I rely heavily on the frameworks developed by other forecasters and other people who thought about the future. One of the people who thought most rigorously about the future of media and entertainment was Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian media theorist. And late in life, his publisher said to him, "Can you write a book called The Laws of Media?" And he did so. And in that book, he posited a thing called McLuhan's tetrad of media effects. And you could search this on the web. It's actually worth reading. It's an incredibly useful tool for thinking about the future of a new medium. So what McLuhan said, in essence, is when there's a new medium introduced, it doesn't have one single impact. It has multiple impacts. It has multiple effects. And so what happens when you have a new medium coming in is it has an impact on current trends. These are trends that we can all observe, trends that we're all familiar with. And he said there's 4 predictable ways it's going to impact those trends. Some trends, the new medium is going to enhance or intensify or accelerate, but other trends, pushed to an extreme, it will reverse. It'll make them go in the opposite direction. And on the other axis, a new medium will render certain practices or trends today obsolete. It'll make them out of date at the same time as it revives something that's currently obsolete and makes it relevant again. So this is McLuhan's tetrad, and we can apply this to cinematic AI by thinking of it this way. So here's my formula, my forecast for the future. I believe that cinematic AI is going to render obsolete the current linear filmmaking process. I think it's going to enhance fragmentation. It's going to accelerate and intensify fragmentation, which is already here. It's already present. It's going to intensify that process. That sounds bad, but I think it'll actually be good. It's also going to revive the idea of remixing and creative reuse, which currently is frowned upon. And finally, I think it's going to reverse industry consolidation, that trend that I spoke about a moment ago. Let's unpack these one by one. I'm going to start with the very first one. Cinematic AI is going to render obsolete the linear filmmaking process. Today, filmmaking is based on a 20th century idea invented by Henry Ford in the auto factory, which is the assembly line. The idea that you have a bunch of people who have specialized skills and they're working on a single project and it moves along through a process. Now, 100 years ago, this is what an auto body factory looked like. A bunch of men, a lot of heavy equipment, and this is what an auto factory plant looks like today. Fully automated, fully robotized. This is the body plant. Now, the finishing plant still has human workers in it. Don't get me wrong, but in the auto body plants around the world, in every auto factory around the world, you don't see human workers welding anymore. Robots are doing that work, and they move so quickly, as you can see in the bottom left of the screen here, that you really can't have human workers working alongside them because they might get injured. Those robots move too fast. That's why they put these robots in cages to keep the humans out. So that's 100 years of progress in the auto assembly line. Now let's look at the motion picture business. In the 1920s, the movie studios started to adopt that assembly line process. And here you can see a picture from a movie set 100 years ago. And as you can see, it's a lot of people and a lot of equipment, right? Well, now here it is today. Here's what a film set looks like today. The only difference is still a lot of people. There's still a lot of equipment. There's no automation. There's no robots except for maybe a motion control rig on a camera. But apart from that, generally speaking, it's still a manual process. It's still that old-fashioned assembly line process. The only thing that's really changed is instead of wearing a suit and tie, these guys are all wearing black T-shirts and workwear. And the interesting thing is that the number of workers continues to increase. In just the last decade, the average number of film members on a feature film has increased by about 50%. So we're going in the wrong direction here, away from automation towards more and more labor-intensive process. That's terrible for the economics of film that I shared with you shortly ago. I think this is happening because modern filmmaking is optimized in an outdated model, a left-to-right assembly line manufacturing process that was invented by Henry Ford 100 years ago, but it's been greatly modified in the auto industry, and the film industry just hasn't caught up to it yet. And the key point on this slide is that film is broken into several phases. There's an early phase of development where we go from a concept to a script. There's a second phase of pre-production. We take that script and break it down, and we figure out the budget and the schedule for production, start to do that scheduling. And we also start to pre-visualize. We'll do storyboards and some concept art at that stage. Then it goes over the fence to principal photography. At this point, we're going to take the decisions that have already been made about the script and the design work and the schedule, and we're going to start to implement them. So there's a crew here that is following orders. They're executing a vision that's already been done in the first couple of stages. And when principal photography is finished, well, we throw the whole project over the fence to another group of people further down the line in post-production. So this is a classic assembly line process where the work continues down the line and it gets thrown over the fence to a different group who implements and builds on what has already been done before. But there are some real flaws in this process. The first one is that the creative process is front-loaded. Most of the creative decisions get made in the first two phases, and the rest of the project is execution. And that's where most of the people are. And most of the hiring is the very last stage of post-production. That's where most of the new hiring is happening. But these are the most creatively disenfranchised people, so they have the least impact on the story. So to me, I think the motion picture companies, where they're investing in more and more labor at the very end of the process, they're actually getting less and less creative ROI out of that investment. I think generative AI is going to transform this process entirely, because instead of a left to right linear process where creative decisions are locked at each phase, you're going to have an iterative cycle based on those affordances that I mentioned just a moment ago. AI makes it possible to respin and iterate on an idea over and over again. And with non-destructive workflows, which are coming this year to artificial intelligence workflows, non-destructive workflows means that we can iterate by saving the elements of the shot that we like and iterating the parts that we don't like. So think of it as like Photoshop layers. You can save the work on the layers that you like, and you can then work on the layers that you want to change and composite the whole thing down later. Something similar is going to occur with AI tools, and that means we're going to have greater control and the ability to iterate to our heart's content. And you don't have to lock any of the decisions. Now, I want to be really clear. Eventually, yes, of course, you do have to lock because you have to get to the final picture. So eventually you have to lock on a story. But what this enables is two things that are very, very powerful that I think are misunderstood by people who are not looking at it this way. The first thing is that film will become a process. Cinematic stories will become a process. You'll be able to iterate on them forever. So it's never going to be a final cut. And we already know that filmmakers want to do this because George Lucas has been doing this his entire career. He's been upgrading Star Wars stories, the early Star Wars films, with better special effects and destroying the original copies so that what's left as his legacy will be the best version he could produce in his lifetime. So we know storytellers who rely heavily on generating effects, they're going to come back to want to tell the story again and again with the best possible methodology. But there's another key point here, and this is the one I really want to emphasize. The iterative cycle means that you're going to confer tremendous creative power. You're going to unlock the creative potential of the people who are at the end of the process in post-production and the editing process. Now, anyone's ever edited a movie knows that you often end up in a situation where you're missing a shot. You wish there was like a reverse angle or cutaway or a reaction shot, but they just didn't get it during production. You can't call the whole crew back. You can't call the cast back. They're already working on a new film. So you're stuck with what you got to work with. That's how it works today. But with generative AI, you'll never be stuck in that situation again. Editors will be able to generate as much as they need. In fact, if they're working on a film project that's going sideways and they know the film's going to be a turkey, they could regenerate the whole story from the post suite. That's a creative idea that is untested. It's brand new, but I think it holds tremendous promise for the future. Next idea, in the Marshall McLuhan tetrad of media effects, what does the new technology accelerate or enhance? I think it's going to enhance fragmentation. Now, that sounds bad because we've had fragmentation in the motion picture business for a long time. Fragmentation across different siloed streaming services, fragmentation across different platforms, fragmentation by genre, fragmentation by audience segment, and so forth. So there's a lot of ways to fragment. I actually think creative people are going to embrace the fragmentation and use it as a tool. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to make TV quality video using generative AI tools that is both hyper-local and hyper-global. Now, let me explain what I mean by that because those terms don't necessarily explain much. First, TV is mostly national. TV shows are generally produced for an audience, a national audience, usually for a TV network or streaming service that's national. There are some shows that are produced for a global audience, but there are very few of those. Today in the United States, there are about 500 scripted series in production. What's a scripted series? That's either a comedy or drama that involves a cast and a crew with a script. And these are the most expensive and complex things to produce for television. So this is the tough stuff. These are the crown jewels of television and streaming services. And there are about 500 of them in production. A few years ago, there were 600. That was peak TV. We've declined a little bit since then as budgets have been cut and production slates have been reduced. But the point I want to make here is using the economics I just said from the previous slides about generative AI affordances, you're going to see a huge increase in the number of scripted series because the cost is going to come down so fast that the budget can be stretched to produce a lot more shows. And so I expect to see a 100x increase, probably a 1,000x increase by 2030. But here's the thing, not all those shows are going to be made in America because anybody anywhere can use generative AI tools to make any show with any cast of any race or gender. And that means that a teenager in a city like Mumbai or Lagos or any place else will be able to generate a TV show with characters that look and act like Californians. It'll look like a show that was shot in Southern California with cars that look like they're American cars, but it can be generated anywhere. And of course, this is not limited to stories about Californians or even North Americans. Instead, what I think you're going to start to see is hyper-localized stories emerge from neighborhoods around the world where people start to tell stories with characters that look like the people in their neighborhood or the people in their country. And they're going to be stories that are familiar to the people in those regions. And so you're going to see a great diversity, I think, a great fragmentation of the kinds of stories that are told in scripted entertainment. Now, the same economics that drive that, of course, are going to drive a tsunami of new videos. A 1,000x increase in the number of shows is a tremendous number of shows. And I might be underestimating the number of shows that are going to come. So we'll have a flood of video. Now, we already know that attention is the scarcest commodity on social media. It's highly contested. And the flood of content is going to confer tremendous power on the attention markets, the big social media platforms that already direct our attention towards advertisers and use algorithmic control to divert us, entertain us, and recommend content to us. How will content creators respond to this? Well, I think what they're going to do is embrace fragmentation as a mechanism for finding their audience. They're going to embrace fragmentation as an adaptive survival behavior that allows them to tell episodic stories that are set in persistent story worlds, kind of like Game of Thrones, if you will, or Star Wars, a familiar story told in a familiar place. But they might use a variety of cinematic styles to do so. And the whole point is they're going to embrace these things to segment the audience down to a specific group of people that they understand and can speak directly to. They're going to find their audience and connect with them. I'll give you an example from the publishing industry. We've already seen a great proliferation of books and titles being created. Fifty Shades of Grey was published in 2015. And 50 Shades of Grey is kind of like the ultimate romance novel. Now, romance is not a new category. It's been around since the beginning of the printing press. It's a very popular and durable category. It's one of the most popular categories of book publishing. And so 50 Shades of Grey is your classic template of a romance story. It's the story of a young woman filled with self-doubt and insecurity who falls under the spell of a rich and powerful man, and romance ensues. That book came out in 2015, and it spawned a whole series of follow-up books. The same year, 2015, Sarah Maas published a book called A Court of Thorns and Roses. And this book is also a romance story, but it's in the genre called romantasy, which is a mashup of classic romance and supernatural stories. And this plot might sound very familiar. It's the story of a young woman filled with self-doubt and insecurity who falls under the spell of a rich and powerful man. But here's the twist. The rich and powerful man has supernatural powers. He is a fae, or a member of the fairy class, and he has supernatural powers. And so that story spins into a whole supernatural realm. And of course, it was a tremendous success, a #1 bestseller. And Sarah Maas published a number of other books in that series. But the one I really want to pay attention to here is The Bone Witch by a Filipina author named Rin Chupeco. And this author did some twists on the classic romance formula. Yes, this is also in the category called romantasy. It's a supernatural tale. And it starts with a young woman who's filled with self-doubt and insecurity. But here's the twist. She doesn't fall under the spell of a rich and powerful guy. Instead, she discovers within herself tremendous capabilities, tremendous powers. And she uses those powers to systematically dismantle the system of oppression that keeps her and other people like her oppressed or repressed or suppressed. And that's not all. That's one twist on the classic romance formula. But this author also happens to identify as non-binary and pansexual. And so she's written for an audience of people who are like-minded. And so as a result, you have every type of romantic interlude and every type of romantic intrigue that you possibly can imagine. It's not limited to men and women. And so we've kind of remixed the formula in a couple of different ways. And the reason Rin Chupeco did this is that they were focused on finding their tribe. And this is what authors and storytellers must do in a highly fragmented market. You embrace the fragmentation of genre. You accelerate the fragmentation of genre to connect directly with a micro audience that resonates with the message you've got. It's a very tailored message for a very tailored group of people. And when you find them, you're going to continue telling stories in that world as long as they're listening. Now, I don't want to make this sound like I'm going to focus solely on gender dynamics or gender orientation. That's not my point at all. My point is that there are a number of different ways to split the audience or divide them. And it's at the intersection of these attributes that we're going to find the most interesting stories emerge when storytellers start to fragment their audience on purpose to connect with them. Add to this one of the other affordances of generative AI, which is that there's a diversity of visual styles available, whether it's this kind of like gothic sci-fi fantasy thing, or the ability to take like a classical art style and animate it and bring it to life, or the ability to mash up some kind of classical art styles together with things like insect life. And here in this example, they're reviving some of the designs by Pablo Picasso and similar artists from the Dada era for the Ballet Russe, and turning those into a kind of a narrative sequence. And here's another great example, just because it's so weird and funny. These are kind of like cybernetic sisters of mercy who are building, they're turning their church into a giant synthesizer. And the point here is that there's a range of diverse visual styles that generative AI makes possible. And when you add that to this fragmentation of genre by audience, you're going to start to see like splinter stories come about. And the idea there is that generative AI will accelerate and intensify and narrow audience segmentation down to a core tribe that really resonates with the story and identifies with it. The reason I'm so confident that this is going to happen is because it's already happened. Last year, in 2025, the big generative AI breakout trend that spread around the world was Italian brain rot. And Italian brain rot was so successful, it got all the way around the world and spawned a whole range of merchandise products, things like coloring books and food products and even apparel like boxer shorts, before Hollywood even woke up and realized that this was a trend. Italian brain rot emerged from the bowels of Roblox, an online game community. And then as it moved around the world, it metastasized and merged with another great trend that was designed to split a generation, to split the audience, to fragment the audience. And that's 6-7. You probably heard about 6-7, but if you didn't, 6-7 is really simple. It doesn't mean anything as a phrase. It carries no content. It's there simply for the purpose of splitting the audience into people who get the joke and people people who don't get the joke. So if you understand 6-7, you're in. If you don't understand 6-7, you're like, what's 6-7 about? You're out. You're not part of that crowd. That's the function of it. That's an exact perfect illustration of splitting the audience and finding a way to segment or fragment the audience down using content. And of course, 6-7 merged with Italian brain rot. You can see that on the right side of the picture. The next trend I want to talk about, or the next effect, media effect on trends that we can observe today, is the idea of retrieving, remixing, and creative use. Now, currently, these concepts are frowned upon by most people in the motion picture business because they liken it to stealing. When the Writers Guild went on strike in 2023, they had a lot of funny signs on the picket lines. The very clever signs. Hey, they're writers. Of course they did. One of their signs was that ChatGPT is a plagiarism machine. And I laughed when I saw it. And I said to the writer who was striking, I was like, well, you know, Hollywood is a plagiarism machine, which, of course, elicited a response of total intensity, fury, pushback, and denial. But I said, no, look, it's very clear. There's a long history of motion picture companies lifting entire storylines and characters from other films made in other parts of the world. But it's not just those examples from the studios. In fact, take a look at this list. Here is a list of some of the most successful motion picture directors in history. And every single one of them has been sued for copyright infringement. And that's not all. The list is longer than what I can display here on this screen. The point I'm trying to make is for all the noise and hoopla that you hear about generative AI companies being sued for copyright infringement, the fact is more motion picture directors have been sued for copyright infringement than all 107 lawsuits filed against generative AI companies for infringement. This is a long-standing tradition in the movie business, and I think generative AI is going to make remixing, creative reuse, great again. You can substitute any word on this list, whether it's borrowing or recycling or the negative terms like plagiarism and stealing. The point is that generative AI is going to make it easy, and it's going to reintroduce us into the vernacular of filmmaking, and I think it's going to revive filmmaking, and I'll show you exactly what I mean on the next set of slides. To do that, I have to explain how genre works. So movies and TV shows rely heavily on genre. The marketing departments of these studios and TV networks need genre to communicate in advance to audiences what the show is about. Why do people care? Why should they be interested in the show? You have to kind of tell them what box it fits in, right? So people think about what movie they want to watch over the weekend. Some folks want to see a romantic comedy. Other folks want to see a sci-fi piece. Some people want to see a thriller. So we need genre to get audiences interested. Now, the problem is when studios and the marketing people rely too heavily on genre, well, then it descends into a cliche, and they start to beat the idea to death, and it gets a little bit worn out, at which point we get to another phase, which is the phase of homage. That's when some filmmakers look back at the high point of that genre fondly, and they try to revive interest in it. But at the same exact moment, another group of filmmakers sees that it's actually a threadbare cliche, and they turn it into a banana peel for comedy, and that's the parody. And the final phase is pastiche. And pastiche is when you reclaim that old genre and reinvent it for a future time. Now, I want to take you through an example of this on the next few slides. From 1945 to 1965, the number one genre in movies and TV was the Western. It was the most popular genre by far. In the 1960s, 8 out of the 10 most popular TV shows were Westerns. This is a very durable trend. In 1960, The Magnificent Seven was released, and many people consider this one of the finest Westerns ever made. But what a lot of people don't know is that the plot is not original. The story for The Magnificent Seven was borrowed from Japanese filmmaker Akira Kurosawa and his film The Seven Samurai, which was released in 1954, 6 years before The Magnificent Seven. So we borrowed the plot from a Japanese filmmaker. That's not the only time this has happened. In 1964, the new genre of spaghetti Western was made. And this was kind of like a revitalization of that old Western-style film. But here, Italian filmmakers like Sergio Leone kind of reclaimed that tired genre, and they distilled out the essence of it. So if you think about a spaghetti Western, you'll remember those super tight close-ups that they hold for a long time of eyes, the grimace, maybe a hand about to draw a gun, or a super wide shot of 3 characters in a Mexican standoff who are about to shoot each other out, and so on. Those are kind of the quintessential elements of the Western genre that turned into cliche and then were redeemed by filmmakers like Sergio Leone. More than 600 spaghetti Westerns were made. But the very first one, A Fistful of Dollars, which was released in 1964, was not an original story. It turns out the original plot for Fistful of Dollars was taken from none other than Akira Kurosawa, another one of his samurai films called Yojimbo. And Kurosawa took one look at Fistful of Dollars and knew he had a copyright infringement case, and he sued, and Leone settled. And later in life, Kurosawa said he was actually quite satisfied with the settlement. He got more money from A Fistful of Dollars than he got from the original film Yojimbo. And later, this story was remade with permission and consent as Last Man Standing with Bruce Willis. The point is, we keep telling the same stories over and over again and reclaiming them. That's a habit in the Hollywood business. Nothing epitomizes this better than Star Wars. And of course, Star Wars does draw on the Western lexicon. The whole character of Han Solo was inspired by those Western characters. It's a bit of a callback to Western characters. But when we think about Star Wars and borrowing, what we tend to think about most is the book Dune by Frank Herbert. And there's a reason for this. Frank Herbert and his advisors took a close look at Star Wars when it came out, and they concluded that there were nearly 100 points of substantial similarity, and that was sufficient for them to generate a lawsuit. However, they did not file a copyright lawsuit because on further contemplation, they realized that both Dune and Star Wars draw heavily from the work of Joe Campbell and the Monomyth and some previous works of fantasy like Lord of the Rings. Now, Star Wars drew on lots of other things besides. It drew on Flash Gordon and World War II fighter pilot films like 12 O'Clock High and, of course, the Western The Searchers. But the most important thing that George Lucas borrowed from when he started Star Wars in the first film was the plot, which was lifted from none other than Japanese director Akira Kurosawa. Again, another film called The Hidden Fortress. So you're starting to see a pattern here. And the question I have to ask is this homage, or is this stealing, or is it a very blurry gray zone in between those two things? Now, when we do this enough times, it becomes so self-referential that it descends into parody. It becomes comic. Even the audience starts to see the outworn tropes of a genre that's been beaten to death. That's why when Disney made so many action hero movies based on the Marvel comic line, that they kind of set themselves up for a parody, and then they actually did a really profoundly great job of parodying themselves with Deadpool. But that was because they had beaten the genre to death before that. Other film franchises do this inadvertently. So you could say that, for instance, in 007, James Bond, that franchise lasted so long that by the time Daniel Craig was making films, they had all these visual callbacks to the kind of heydays, the glory days, the days when it was fresh, when Sean Connery played 007. But that callback, that self-referential nature, set that whole franchise up for a series of brutal parodies by Johnny English, by Rowan Atkinson. In fact, some filmmakers like Mel Brooks made an entire career out of lampooning tired genres. But just when a genre is completely depleted, it shifts from parody to pastiche. And this is really what I want to draw your attention to in this section, because I think this is where generative AI is going to help us and maybe accelerate something. So pastiche is like a blank parody. It's parody without the comic element, without the sarcasm, or without the critique or criticism. It's a blank parody in the sense that it doesn't really signify anything. It's reusing tropes, it's reusing familiar elements, it's reusing storylines and some familiar characters, but it's not doing with an attempt to comment on the original material, and certainly not in a satirical way. Instead, it's doing something different. It's imbuing those old tropes with new meaning. It's turning them into a vernacular for a new kind of storytelling, and in a way, it's creative recycling. So we've seen many versions of this. Films like Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid and Zelig actually mingled new footage with classic film footage in a way that was almost indistinguishable to audiences at that time. Other films like The Artist and Mank, here the cinematographers and the filmmakers went to great lengths to recreate the conditions, techniques of old films to kind of invoke the mood from a previous period, because that accelerated or enhanced the story that they're trying to tell. When pastiche is done right, it doesn't just recap a genre or recycle a genre. It redeems the genre and elevates the genre. And you can say that is true of Dr. Strangelove, which redeemed the kind of, end of the world nuclear terror film, which was a genre of its own in the 60s, and Prince's Bride, which did the same for fantasy stories. These began as satires, but what they ended up doing was redeeming and elevating the genre themselves. And when we talk about pastiche, we have to acknowledge the ultimate master, the person who packs more film references into a single story than any other director in history. I'm talking, of course, about Quentin Tarantino. And Tarantino is very clear about what he's doing. He says, I steal from every movie ever made. If people don't like it, then tough titty, don't go see it. Great artists steal. They don't do homage. He doesn't do homage. So he's very clear about what he's doing here. Now, I think generative AI is going to accelerate this. I think it's going to redeem the idea of borrowing and doing homage, maybe doing references, maybe remixing, respinning, because Gen AI is a pop culture blender. If it's anything, that's what it is at its heart. It's a mashup machine. And you can see already, just a glance at Instagram will show you that there are dozens of tools that make it incredibly easy to transform a character. And the one on the left, you can see this woman in a regular green sweater has turned her, got a branded shirt on, or she can transform the background that she's in. In the middle, you can put a character in a costume. And on the right, you can transform someone, a regular person shot with an iPhone. You can transform them into a Navi character or even Super Mario. This is trivially easy to do. And I think it's actually going to regenerate some of those tired cliche stories. I think what we're going to see with generative AI is a kind of simultaneous stacking of these techniques. And so a single filmmaker in a single story will combine parody with cliche and pastiche and remix together with visual references from a range of different films. They'll blend them together, style blending, story blending, various types of recycling and referencing. They'll stack the references up. And that's not all. Not only will Gen AI help filmmakers and storytellers increase the reference density in their films, but it's also going to create an opportunity for the audience to remix these stories and begin to appropriate them and tell their own stories. Now, I know this outrages many people who believe in the sanctity of the artistic output of an individual artist. I understand that that rubs them the wrong way, but we have to understand what movie making really is and why filmmakers borrow from each other so much. If you're in the movie making business, if you're in the cinematic storytelling business, you are in the myth making business. And myth making is never the work of an individual. Myth making is a cultural process of co-creation and the recycling and retelling of familiar stories in different ways, in different contexts, by different narrators over time. That's what makes them myths. And that's why these tropes from Hollywood are so enduring, and it's why we will return to them again and again and again. Gen AI is simply going to enable millions of people to do this. Final point. I believe that generative AI, cinematic AI, is going to reverse the trend of industry consolidation that I began with. And the reason for this is actually quite simple. With generative AI, your film crew can be anywhere. You can collaborate with filmmakers, story makers, sound designers, character designers, costume designers, anywhere in the world. And so it's placeless innovation and remote collaboration. And I think that's going to unlock tremendous amounts of creativity. Many of the people who use generative AI will live in places where there isn't a filmmaking center. There is no movie studio. Many of the people who use generative AI will never set foot on the lot at Warner Brothers or Sony Pictures. For these people, generative AI is going to unlock the imaginative potential and the storytelling capability that otherwise would go stifled and untold. And I think it's going to be a net gain for humanity. Ultimately, what I'm describing are tools. I've just given you examples of dozens of different ways generative AI can be used by a tool in the hands of an artist. I don't think generative AI is going to make stories on its own automatically with the push of a button. I'm skeptical about that scenario. At least in the near term, it seems implausible to me, and I can't imagine why I'd want to watch a story told by a robot. But generative AI tools in the hands of artists and storytellers will enable many more people to tell many kinds of stories that otherwise would be cost prohibitive, or the studio system that we currently have would make it impossible to tell that story or release it or distribute it. At the end of the day, storytelling as an art is the art of making conscious decisions among known alternatives. This is what storytellers do. They don't just randomly stitch together a bunch of incidents. They have a full understanding of each of the storytelling elements and why they selected it. And they understand the effect that adding it in will offer and how it'll enhance their story. And I believe generative AI is going to greatly expand the expressive potential of artists and storytellers. So that's it. I'm Rob Tercek. If you're interested in this, you can scan this QR code and give me some feedback. I'd be happy to hear from you. And then you can download the slides from this talk. So thanks very much for listening. I've enjoyed sharing this with you. I've got much more to say on the topic, and I know this was a lot to take in, but I actually have much more to say about the subject. And you can find me on Substack, where I've been writing about this extensively. So thanks again for listening. Rob Tercek here saying thank you, and I'll see you in the future.